Let's take a moment and talk about your DSLR's frame rate and why at some point it might make sense to upgrade to a DSLR with a quicker frame rate. Again, this is not me encouraging you to go right now and buy a new DSLR. In fact, close that Amazon window. I know one of you out there has it open. You're like, oh yeah, I'm gonna drop $3 grand because this one does 7 frames a second. But whatever it is, do not buy right now. What I'm saying is, the frame rate is going to have an overall impact on your HDR photographs. Now just imagine this, if we are in situations where we have to hand hold our camera, then frame rate is going to matter big time in those situations. If we're shooting a bracketed sequence, we don't have a tripod, we can't have a tripod in that scene, then the frame rate is going to be huge. Why? Because if I have a camera that can shoot at 10 frames a second versus a camera that can only shoot at 3 or at 5, then basically that camera is going to mitigate all the motion blur, or at least most of the motion blur that I would get if I was shooting at 3 frames a second or at 5 frames a second. Because it's going to do it in a much shorter time. So there's much less time for me to move, there's much less time to basically introduce any types of movement and blur into the image. In these types of scenes, the frame rate is going to have an impact. More often than not, if you're shooting on a tripod, it really doesn't matter except for dealing with ghosting. Okay, ghosting is the other thing that frame rate will basically kind of mitigate. Again, because if your camera can shoot 10 frames a second as opposed to 3 frames a second, then again, you're shooting 3 frames within 1/3 of a second as opposed to 1 full second. So objects that are moving, they have less time to move across the frame. And if the objects are moving slow, you might not even notice that type of movement. So your overall DSLR frame rate will have an impact on your HDR photographs. Now, if you're considering purchasing a new DSLR and you're big into HDR photography, then frame rate should be one of the considerations when you're buying or upgrading your DSLR. If it does 7 as opposed to 5, that's even better. If it does 10 as opposed to 7, that's even better. It's going to come down to budget, what you can afford, what kind of camera that you want, but just know that frame rate is going to play into your HDR photography. Number one, when we don't have a tripod, when we can't have a tripod, it's going to help us basically shoot our shots quicker and introduce less movement with handheld bracketed sequences. And number two, with a quicker frame rate, we run through our bracketed sequences faster, thus reducing the overall ghosting that we're going to get in each frame. So if HDR photography is important to you and you're considering at some point purchasing or upgrading your current DSLR, then frame rate should be one of those considerations because it is going to have an impact in your HDR photographs. Particularly number one, when you don't have or can't use a tripod, it'll help you to get bracketed sequences that have less motion and movement in them. And number two, dealing with scenes with moving objects, it will mitigate the ghosting that is created from the HDR processing layering of those images. All right, so let's move on to the next video.